Dan Blocker had just crouched down to retie a little girl's bonnet between takes when her small hand went limp in his palm, and her eyes rolled back under the afternoon sun. Remember this instant, because what happens in the next 60 seconds will show every parent watching from behind the rope line whether the big cowboy on television is the same man when the cameras are not rolling. The day had started with laughter. The little girl's name was Sarah, 7 years old, hired for a single scene that required her to walk across the dusty street, holding a basket of bread, while Dan delivered his lines from the porch of the general store. It was the kind of background work that child actors did all the time on Western productions. Simple and safe. A few hours of waiting, followed by a few minutes of walking, and then a paycheck that would go into a savings account. Her parents had opened the day she was born. The morning air had been cool enough to be pleasant, carrying the smell of coffee from the craft services table, and the dry woody scent of the false-fronted buildings, baking in the early sun. Sarah had been excited. Her mother had told her stories about the show, about the big friendly cowboy who made everyone laugh, and Sarah had spent the whole drive to the studio asking questions. Would she get to meet him? Would he be as tall as he looked on television? Would he remember her if she saw him again someday? The western street set stretched out under a sky that had started blue and was slowly turning white with heat. The sun was directly overhead now, pressing down on everyone with the particular weight of a California summer afternoon, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the packed dirt and turned every metal surface into something that could burn skin. The crew had set up shade tents for the extras, but the shooting area itself was exposed, baking in the light that the cameras needed to capture the authentic look of a frontier town. Somewhere a horse whinnied softly in the holding area, and the sound seemed to emphasize rather than break the heavy stillness that had settled over everything. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? Because what happened in the next few minutes is the kind of story that never made it into the publicity packets or the fan magazines. But it is the kind of story that tells you everything you need to know about who Dan Blocker was when it mattered most. Dan had noticed Sarah almost immediately when she arrived on set. He always noticed the children. There was something about having kids on a Western production that changed the energy, softened it somehow, reminded everyone that the make-believe violence they staged for cameras was meant to be seen by families sitting together in living rooms across the country. He made a point of introducing himself to every child actor who came through, crouching down to their level so he would not tower over them, shaking their small hands with exaggerated formality that always made them giggle. Sarah had giggled too. She had looked up at him with eyes that seemed too big for her face, and said very seriously that her grandmother watched his show every single week and had told her to say hello. Dan had promised to wave at the camera just for her grandmother during the next episode, and Sarah had nodded solemnly, as if they had just concluded a business negotiation of the highest importance. That had been 3 hours ago. 3 hours of waiting in the shade tent while the crew set up shot after shot, adjusting lights and repositioning cameras and doing all the invisible work that made television possible. 3 hours of the sun climbing higher, and the temperature climbing with it, the air turning thick and still and hard to breathe. Look at the set now. In the moment before everything changed. The wooden storefronts, baking in the heat, their false fronts casting sharp shadows across the dusty street. The crew members, moving slowly, conserving energy, wiping sweat from their foreheads between tasks. The extras clustered in whatever shade they could find, fanning themselves with call sheets and script pages. And in the center of it all, Dan Blocker in his full costume, standing on the porch of the general store, waiting for the director to call action on what should have been a simple, unremarkable shot. The production had 2 hours and 45 minutes of shooting left before they would lose the afternoon light. The assistant director had been watching the sky nervously, tracking the slow drift of clouds that threatened to change the lighting conditions at any moment. Every minute counted. Every delay cost money. The pressure to keep moving, to get the shots, to stay on schedule, pressed down on everyone almost as heavily as the heat itself. Sarah's mother was standing behind the rope line that separated the visitors from the working set. She had been watching her daughter with the particular intensity of a parent who has entrusted their child to strangers, even temporarily, even for something as safe as walking across a fake street with a basket of bread. She had noticed that Sarah seemed tired during the last hour, quieter than usual. But she had attributed it to the waiting. Children got bored. Children got restless. It was normal. What was not normal was what happened next. The assistant director called for final positions. Sarah walked out from the shade tent, her basket clutched in both hands, her bonnet slightly askew from where it had shifted during the long wait. Dan saw her coming and smiled, that big warm smile that had made him famous, and he stepped down from the porch to meet her. Notice how natural this moment seemed to everyone watching. A tall man in a cowboy costume, crouching down to fix a little girl's hat. The kind of thing that happened on sets all the time. The small kindnesses that filled the gaps between takes. Nobody was alarmed. Nobody had any reason to be. Dan's large fingers worked gently at the bonnet's ribbons, which had come loose and were hanging down past Sarah's chin. He was saying something to her, something quiet, that made her smile weakly, when he felt her hand touch his palm. She had reached out to steady herself, a small gesture that most people would not have noticed. But Dan noticed. He noticed because the hand that touched his was not gripping. It was not reaching. It was simply there, resting against his skin, with no strength behind it at all. And then before he could even process what he was feeling, the hand went completely limp. He looked up at her face and saw her eyes roll backward, the pupils disappearing behind fluttering lids, the color draining from her cheeks like water running out of a sink. Her knees buckled, the basket of bread tumbled from her other hand and spilled across the dust. Wait. Before we go any further, you need to understand the speed at which Dan Blocker moved. This was not a moment of hesitation followed by action. This was pure instinct, the kind of response that comes from somewhere deeper than thought. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Dan's arms were around Sarah, catching her before she could hit the ground, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing at all. The set went silent. The kind of silence that falls when something has gone terribly wrong and nobody knows yet how wrong it is going to get. The only sound was the distant hum of the generators and the soft whisper of dust settling around the fallen bread. Sarah's mother screamed. It was not a word, not a name, just a raw sound of terror that cut through the silence like a blade. She was already moving, already pushing past the rope line, already running toward her daughter with the desperate speed of a parent who has just seen their worst nightmare begin to unfold. But Dan was faster, not in running but in thinking. In the instant that Sarah collapsed, his mind had already moved through the possibilities: heat, exhaustion, dehydration, something worse. Whatever it was, she needed to be out of the sun. She needed water. She needed a doctor. And she needed all of those things now. Not in the minutes it would take for panic to turn into action. 2 hours and 30 minutes of shooting light remained. But Dan had stopped counting. He rose to his feet with Sarah in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, her bonnet finally falling free and landing in the dust beside the scattered bread. He did not wait for someone to tell him what to do. He did not look to the director for permission. He simply turned and walked, his long strides carrying them both toward the nearest shade structure, a canvas tent that had been set up for the crew near the equipment trucks. Listen to what happened in the next 30 seconds. The mother reached them just as Dan ducked into the shade, her hands reaching for her daughter, her voice a stream of words that did not quite form sentences. Dan did not give Sarah to her. Not yet. Instead, he knelt down and laid the girl carefully on a folding cot that someone had been using for their lunch break, positioning her so her feet were slightly elevated, his movements practiced and precise. Water. he said. His voice was calm, controlled, the voice of a man who had seen emergencies before and knew that panic helped no one. Cold water and wet cloths. Someone call for a doctor. Now, the crew erupted into motion. The paralysis that had gripped them since Sarah collapsed broke like a fever, and suddenly everyone was moving. Everyone had a purpose. Everyone was doing something, instead of standing frozen in the terrible space between crisis and response. A grip appeared with a bottle of water. A wardrobe assistant brought damp cloths from the costume trailer. 2 hours and 20 minutes of shooting light remained. But nobody was looking at the sky now. Someone was already on the phone, calling for medical help, their voice urgent but steady. The machinery of the production, which had been designed to create fiction, was now being repurposed to deal with something real. Dan took one of the wet cloths and pressed it gently against Sarah's forehead, then against her cheeks, then along the sides of her neck, where the pulse points lay close to the surface. Her skin was hot to the touch, dry where it should have been damp with sweat, flushed an unhealthy red that stood out even under the shade of the tent. Heat exhaustion, maybe heat stroke. He had seen it before, years ago, in places where the sun was even more unforgiving than a California studio lot. He knew what it looked like. He knew what it required. He knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this ended as a scary story or a tragedy. Sarah. He spoke her name softly, close to her ear. Sarah, can you hear me? You're going to be okay. You're safe. I've got you. Remember the parents who were watching from behind the rope line, not just Sarah's mother, who was now kneeling beside the cot with tears streaming down her face, but the other parents too, the ones who had brought their children for background work, the ones who were now holding their kids a little closer, wondering if they had made a terrible mistake by bringing them here. They were all watching Dan Blocker, watching how he handled this moment, watching to see if the man on the television was worth the trust they had placed in this production. Sarah's eyelids fluttered. A small sound escaped her lips, something between a moan and a whimper. Her hand moved weakly, reaching for something, finding Dan's finger and curling around it with the desperate grip of a child who does not understand what is happening, but knows she is afraid. There you are, Dan said. His voice cracked slightly on the words, the first sign of the emotion he had been holding back. There's my brave girl. You just got a little too hot. That's all. We're going to cool you down, and you're going to feel much better, I promise. 2 hours and 15 minutes of shooting light remained. The director was standing at the edge of the shade tent, his face a mask of conflicting concerns. The schedule, the budget, the child, the liability. Dan could see him calculating, weighing options, trying to figure out how to salvage something from a day that had just gone sideways in the worst possible way. Dan looked up at him, and something in his expression made the director take a step backward. We're done for the day, Dan said. It was not a suggestion. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly where the lines were and was not willing to let anyone cross them. Notice what happened next. The director opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He was going to argue. He was going to point out that they were behind schedule, that the network was expecting dailies, that there were contractual obligations and financial penalties, and 100 other reasons why they could not simply shut down production because one child had gotten overheated. But then he looked at Dan Blocker's face. He looked at the little girl on the cot, still pale, still weak, still clinging to the big man's finger, like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become frightening and uncertain. He looked at the mother, whose eyes were red with tears and fear and gratitude all mixed together, and whatever he had been planning to say died somewhere between his brain and his mouth. Call it, the director said to his assistant. We're wrapped for the day. Send everyone home. The assistant director nodded and reached for his radio. 2 hours of usable light remained, but for the first time all day, The schedule was not the priority. Within minutes, the announcement was spreading across the set. Production was suspended. Medical personnel were on the way. Wait. Stop for a moment and picture this scene from above. The shade tent, in the center of organized chaos. The crew members packing up equipment with unusual gentleness. The parents gathering their children, holding them close, some crying quietly with relief that it was not their child on that cot. And at the center of it all, Dan Blocker on his knees beside a 7-year-old girl, holding her hand, talking to her in a low, steady voice about horses and sunshine, and the grandmother who was going to be so proud of her. The studio medic arrived first, a tired-looking woman with a bag over her shoulder who had clearly seen her share of on-set emergencies. She checked Sarah's pulse, her temperature, her responsiveness. Heat exhaustion, she confirmed. Not heat stroke, thank God, but serious enough to require rest, fluids, and monitoring. The ambulance that was already on its way would take her to the hospital for observation, just to be safe. Sarah's mother was beside herself with gratitude and guilt in equal measure. She kept thanking Dan, kept apologizing to him, kept asking if there was anything she could do. Dan just shook his head and told her that the only thing she needed to do was take care of her daughter. That was all that mattered. That was the only thing that had ever mattered since the moment Sarah's hand went limp in his palm. Listen closely to what happened when the ambulance arrived. The paramedics came into the tent with a stretcher, ready to load Sarah for transport. She was conscious now, sitting up with help, drinking small sips of water from a cup that Dan held for her. The color was coming back to her cheeks. Her eyes, when she looked up at Dan, were focused and clear. "I don't want to go," she whispered. Her voice was small and scared. The voice of a child who had just experienced something frightening and did not want to face anything else today. "I want to stay here with you." Dan's heart broke. You could see it happen. See the crack appear in the careful composure he had maintained throughout the crisis. He blinked hard, once, twice, and when he spoke again, his voice was rougher than before. "You have to go with these nice people," he said. "They're going to make sure you're okay, and your mama's going with you, so you won't be alone for even 1 second." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I'll tell you what, when you're feeling better, you come back here and visit me. We'll have lunch together, just you and me, and I'll tell you all the secrets about how we make the show. Deal?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "Deal," she whispered. 1 hour and 45 minutes of shooting light remained. Not that anyone was counting anymore. The paramedics loaded Sarah onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency, tucking a light blanket around her despite the heat, because her body needed to regulate and cool naturally now. Her mother climbed into the ambulance beside her, never letting go of her daughter's hand, her face a mask of relief and lingering fear. As the doors closed, Sarah lifted her hand and waved, a small gesture that Dan returned with a wave of his own, and a smile that he hoped looked more confident than he felt. He stood there watching until the ambulance disappeared around the corner of the soundstage, its lights flashing, but its siren mercifully silent. Remember what I said at the beginning about the parents behind the rope line? They had been watching everything, every moment, every gesture, every word that Dan Blocker had spoken since their children arrived on set that morning. They had seen him greet each child personally. They had seen him make Sarah laugh before everything went wrong. And they had seen him catch her when she fell, move faster than anyone else, take charge of a crisis with the calm competence of someone who understood that children were not props to be used and discarded. Now those parents were gathering around him, not to complain, not to threaten lawsuits, not to demand explanations. They were gathering to thank him. One by one, they approached Dan Blocker and shook his hand, some of them with tears in their eyes, all of them with words of gratitude that seemed too small for what they were trying to express. "You saved her," one father said, his voice thick with emotion. "The way you moved, the way you caught her. If she had hit the ground, If she had hit her head, he could not finish the sentence. Dan shook his head. I just did what anyone would have done. No, the father said firmly. You didn't. You did what you would have done. That's different. That's something else entirely. Notice how Dan received this praise. He did not puff up with it. He did not deflect it with false modesty. He simply accepted it as the honest expression of honest people, nodded his thanks, and then gently steered the conversation toward what mattered, making sure all the children got home safely, making sure the parents had the production office's number in case they had questions or concerns, making sure that everyone understood that what happened today was a fluke, a terrible accident, and that every precaution would be taken to ensure it never happened again. The director approached him after the last of the families had left. 1 hour and 15 minutes of shooting light remained, but the set was already half struck. The crew working with quiet efficiency to pack up equipment that would not be needed today. The day's schedule was a loss. The budget would take a hit. The network would have questions. None of that showed on the director's face. What showed instead was something that looked almost like admiration. That was something, the director said. The way you handled that. I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never seen anyone move that fast. Dan was sitting on the edge of the porch where, hours ago, he had been waiting to deliver a line about horses and weather and the simple concerns of a fictional frontier town. He looked tired. He looked older than he had looked that morning, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. She trusted me, Dan said. All those kids, they trust us. They come onto our set, and they believe what we tell them, that it's safe, that we'll take care of them, that nothing bad will happen. That little girl looked up at me this morning, like I was something special, like I was the character I play, the one who always does the right thing. How could I let her down? The director was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if he had just understood something that had been confusing him for a long time. Same time tomorrow? He asked. 50 minutes of usable light remained. Not that it mattered now. Same time tomorrow, Dan confirmed. But I want shade structures over the whole shooting area, and water stations every 50 feet, and mandatory breaks every 30 minutes. When the temperature goes above 85, I don't care what it costs. We're not putting anyone else at risk, not ever again. It was not a request, it was a condition. And the director knew better than to argue. Done, he said. And he meant it. The sun was lower now, the light turning golden as afternoon began its slow slide toward evening. The western street set looked different in this light, softer somehow, less like a working production facility, and more like what it pretended to be, a small town at the edge of civilization, a place where good people tried to live good lives in a hard world. Dan sat there for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the dust. He was thinking about Sarah, wondering if she was at the hospital yet, hoping her tests would come back clear. He was thinking about his own children, about how he would feel if one of them collapsed on a stranger's watch. He was thinking about the weight of trust, and how heavy it became when you realized how easily it could be broken. 3 weeks later, Sarah came back to the set. She was fully recovered, her cheeks pink with health, her eyes bright with excitement. She was wearing a new dress that her mother had bought for the occasion, and she was carrying a hand-drawn card that she had made herself. The card showed a large figure in a cowboy hat, holding hands with a small figure in a bonnet. Above them, written in careful 7-year-old letters, were the words, "Thank you for catching me." Dan accepted the card with the gravity it deserved, examining it carefully, asking questions about the artistic choices she had made, treating it like the precious thing it was. Then he kept his promise. He took Sarah to lunch in the studio commissary, just the two of them, and he told her secrets about how they made the horses behave, and how they made the gunfights look real, and how the saloon doors were designed to swing just right every single time. If you want to hear what happened on the night Dan Blocker received a letter that made him question everything he thought he knew about his own past, tell me in the comments. because this was not the only time a child needed him to be more than just an actor. There were other days, other children, other moments when the line between the man and the character disappeared completely. And every single time, Dan Blocker was exactly who he needed to be. Not because he was playing a role, not because cameras were watching, but because that was simply who he was, all the way through, from the outside to the center and back again. That was Dan Blocker, a man who caught falling children before they hit the ground, a man who held small hands and made big promises and kept every single one of them, a man who understood that the greatest role he would ever play was not the one written in the scripts, but the one written in the trust of every person who ever looked up at him and believed. The Western Street set is gone now. The shade structures have been taken down and put back up for different productions 100 times over. The children who worked there have grown up and had children of their own, some of whom have never seen an episode of the show that made Dan Blocker famous. But somewhere, in a frame on a wall in a house you have never visited, there is a hand-drawn card showing a cowboy and a little girl. And somewhere in the memory of a woman who was once that little girl, there is an afternoon that started with excitement and turned to terror and ended with a promise kept. That is the inheritance that Dan Blocker left behind. Not fame, not fortune, not the flickering images on a television screen, but moments of grace in the middle of crisis, hands that caught and held and would not let go, a voice that said you're going to be okay, and meant it with everything he had. And maybe that is enough. And maybe that is everything that truly matters in the very end, when the lights go down and the cameras stop, and all that remains is the truth of who we were when someone needed us to be more than we thought we could be.